Hi everyone, and welcome to this recording on PRISM, which is the product safety risk assessment methodology. Let me introduce myself really quickly, and also Mark Gardner will introduce himself in a moment. But my name is Geraldine Kosh. I'm a product safety consultant. I've worked in product safety for 20 years. I work with training standards officers on risk assessment and product safety. I'm also the technical author of a number of PASs, which we'll talk very briefly about, but PAS 7100, 7050, and 7055. I've also worked as a technical expert on the CAST projects, which are coordinated activity for the safety of products. I've specifically worked on injury data, crisis management, and risk assessment, and as an expert witness. And I'm also a CTSI, which is the Chartered Trading Standards Institute, who are putting this session on for you. I'm a lead officer for product safety. Mark.
Thank you, Geraldine. Hello, everybody. My name's Mark Gardner. I spent 28 years working as a trading standards officer, specialising in product safety. And for the last 8 years, I've been a consultant working in the UK, EU, and further afield, providing advice to economic operators and government departments on product safety and risk. And so I'm a specialist in risk analysis and risk management, but also conformity assessment. I've done many of the same things that Geraldine has done as a consultant. I'm also an expert witness and things like that. But when I worked in trading standards, I chaired the Low Voltage Directive Administrative Cooperation Group. That's always a mouthful. National Product Safety Focus Group, Southwest Regional Product Safety Group, and a number of other strategic bodies as well. I've been heavily involved in the training and qualification of trading standards officers for many, many years now. So I share the product safety portfolio with Geraldine, but I'm also the lead portfolio verifier, portfolio author, regulating markets, paper examiner, but also the trainer and the product safety examiner.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is supplying safe product and PAS 7050 and 7100, but only really briefly on those two topics because we've done a lot of sessions on those previously. So we're going to show you on where you can get more information. But fundamentally, risk assessment and risk management underpins supplying a safe product and also underpins PAS 7050 and 7100. So PAS 7050 is on bringing safe products to market, and PAS 7100 is about corrective actions and recalls. And then we're going to get into the specifics of risk assessment, which is really the focus of this session. So let us show you really quickly where you can get more information on PAS 7050 and 7100. So if you look here at the business companion, we've got here a guide that talks about PAS 7050, 7100 and PRISM, which we're going to be talking about today. And then also there's a 3-part webinar series for online businesses on product safety. But I would say regardless of whether you're an online business or not, these sessions are going to be really relevant for you. So have a look at those if you haven't. And then we're going to talk about risk assessment here, and hopefully you'll be able to see the connection between those things. Okay, so let's start on risk assessment. So, Mark, what is product risk assessment?
Thank you, Geraldine. Well, there are many things that product risk assessment are not. And the first thing is it's not a prediction of future events. When you start talking about risk assessment, those are two words that strike fear into many people because they're like, how can I predict what's going to happen in the future? And it's not that. It is a simple decision-making tool. So it's a numerative, meaning allocating values to particular parameters within any system to allow decisions to be made. So it provides a basis for the formulation of quantitative but also qualitative data into a quantitative judgment. To translate, you can make decisions by rating the values, combining them in a particular way, and coming out with an outcome. And in very simple terms, risk can be considered tolerable or intolerable. We all make these decisions every day in our lives. We understand our own risk, personal risk, business risk, and all those things, and we go, yeah, I can live with that, or no, I can't live with that. Where the risk is intolerable, we would usually take action to reduce it to a tolerable level. And this, in very, very technical terms, is called risk management. So risk management is the act of making an intolerable risk tolerable. But human beings all have very different perceptions of risk and different risk appetites. So it's highly subjective, and that's where the complication comes in. But what risk assessment methodologies seek to do is to reduce that subjectivity to a minimum. So next slide, please. Risk assessment methodology provide this basis for objectivity. Consistent methodology determine tolerability can result in consistent decision making about the necessity for risk management in action risk management action. In other words, if you allocate a value to tolerable and intolerable, then you can take decisions arising from that. One of the difficulties in carrying out any risk assessment is data and access to the reliable data sets, correct data sets about products, processes, but also, and this is the big difficulty with product safety, human decision making and human behavior. How do people interact with the products? How may they use it? What is foreseeable? And so what risk assessment methodologies seek to do in all of that uncertainty is impose an objective framework on this subjective process and this subjective data that underpins it. So let's talk about PRISM. PRISM is a risk assessment methodology. There are lots and lots of different methodologies which are contextual, applying to different activities, different processes. PRISM is a specifically product safety risk assessment methodology, which determines the risk in a product that exists. And it applies to particular type of products. So any product that's covered by Regulation 3 of the General Product Safety Regulations, that is the horizontal regulation on all consumer products that applies across the board. Sometimes there are products which have their own specific regulations as well, which have specific requirements that go over and above what the General Product Safety Regulations apply to. And those listed in Article 15 of Regulation 765/2008 are also covered by PRISM. I'm going to simplify that. That's consumer products with a CE or UKCA mark. So toys, electrical products, things like that. So if it's a consumer product, PRISM applies to it. It doesn't apply to certain things that consumers have, though. So food and feed, because there is a specific risk assessment methodology for food and feed. Medical products covered by human medicines regulations, but also veterinary medicines regulations. Those are excluded again because they have their own risk assessment methodology. Medical devices covered by medical devices regulations, but also antiques or products to be repaired prior to use. That is because they are excluded from the provisions of the General Product Safety Regulations. And therefore, you wouldn't apply the same risk parameters to it. And finally, equipment used by professional service providers to supply a service. So things that are in control of somebody else who is a professional providing you with a service. They are excluded. So let's define some terms. And these terms can cause confusion. And I hear even professionals sometimes say hazard when they mean risk and risk when they mean hazard. And I know Geraldine knows that I have a particular pedantic itch when it comes to this, and it's because we need clarity. We need clarity in our expression. So a hazard is something which has the potential, is a potential source of harm. So it is some characteristic of a product that has the potential to cause harm. It is not risk in itself. It requires an interaction with a human being. So what do we mean by harm? Well, adverse impact on individuals, environment, infrastructure, property, animals, businesses. It can include human injury or ill health. That's the one we normally think about when we think about product safety. But it can also include, depending on the regulations, damage, including disruptions to property, damage to the environment, or even economic loss. Not all harms are created equal. So we also need to consider the severity of the harm. So how bad is it? And what risk assessment does is allocate a numerical value to it. But when we're talking about this, we're talking about physical, psychological, environmental. The hazard has the potential to cause can be different in terms of severity. The severity of the harm thus reflects the effect the hazard has on the subject under the conditions described in the particular probability, a particular scenario. We will expand on that because that's a bit of a mouthful, and I know that may not gel with everybody, but we'll come and expand these terms later. So severity is a value. Probability is another value. Probability is the likelihood, and it's usually a probability estimate of the identified hazard causing the harm. So there's a particular set of circumstances that lead to that hazard that exists in the product to a harm with an allocated severity within the particular set of circumstances. So it refers to the harm scenario that may indeed materialize during the expected duration of the hazard. And then risk is one of our key terms. It's a function of the level of the hazard and the likelihood or probability that the hazard will cause harm. In other words, it's combining those terms. And risk assessment is a further combination of those terms. So it's the process by which the level of risk associated with a particular hazard is identified, but more importantly, or as importantly, categorized. So it's that categorization that gives us the basis for our decision making. But we also need to evaluate that. So what you need to do following that categorization is evaluate that. And risk evaluation is the process by which the outcome of a risk assessment is combined with other stuff, policy considerations, to characterize the risk and inform decisions on risk management. In other words, it is, can we live with this or not? And that is a complex construct based on individual risk tolerability, policy, and lots of other things when we're talking about product safety decision making. And if it is not tolerable, then risk management will follow. And risk management, and again, we will expand on this in further detail, is the elimination, control, or mitigation of risk. In other words, it's the processes you put in place to take an intolerable risk and make it tolerable. And let's define tolerability just to make sure the acceptability of a perceived risk based on the current values of society. We've got two other terms that we want to just define at the start here, which are specific to one specific to PRISM, and one is something which overlies the whole of product safety legislation. So a risk differential is the difference between the level of risk presented by a non-compliant product and the level of risk that a product would present if fully compliant. This is necessary because some products, say ladders or trampolines or chainsaws, could be considered quite high risk, but be compliant with the law. So you need a measure of the differential between a compliant product and maybe a chainsaw that doesn't include a brake or a guard or something like that. They may have almost the same risk rating in terms of that numerative output, but have very different levels of tolerability. And finally, the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is the principle under which protective action is taken for the purpose of avoiding harm from an identified hazard in circumstances where there is limited or no reliable evidence on the extent of the risk posed by that hazard. And this is on the basis that taking no action could allow significant harm to occur. This is enshrined in the General Product Safety Regulation. It says that regulators must take account of the precautionary principle when making decisions. In other words, where there's clear scientific uncertainty, but there is the potential for significant harm, they should act to manage that risk anyway. And the example I always give on training is the action of governments around the world at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where the level of risk wasn't clear from the scientific data, how many people would succumb to it and just how contagious it was, but it looked bad. And despite that scientific uncertainty, the precautionary measure was things like lockdowns and all of those other things. So next slide. So all of these definitions are included in the OPS&S, Office of Product Safety and Standards Risk Lexicon, which you can find by following this link, which I believe is in the written version of this presentation as well. So it includes basic terms such as hazard, harm, and risk, but also terms you may be less familiar with, such as evaluation, risk evaluation, and risk differential. So I recommend having a look at that. It isn't just a lexicon, it's very informative, and it will help to explain just how risk assessment methodologies work. So the question always asked as a consultant, as a regulator, what's the level of risk that's considered non-compliant? And there is no absolute. I've already mentioned chainsaws, ladders, trampolines. Those products may be considered high risk, but other products may be considered low risk. Is there an absolute level? No. It is therefore necessary to determine what is tolerable. Um, Serious risk does require rapid intervention by virtue of what's known as GB RAMS. GB, that's Great Britain Regulation and Accreditation of Market Surveillance Regulation. But this refers to the timing rather than the type of corrective measure. So serious risk is the highest level of risk. You also have high, medium, and low. And broadly speaking, the following rule of thumb can be applied. A serious or high level of risk will normally be intolerable, but there are exceptions. A medium level of risk is likely to equate to an intolerable risk, which means that medium is more likely to be intolerable than tolerable. But again, there are many exceptions, and a low level of risk is unlikely to equate to an intolerable risk, but it can. So this is guidance. It only can be guidance because there is no absolute level of risk. We always have to consider who's using the product, how they're using the product, the utility of the product, and all of those other things. So what's the legal basis for the consideration of risk? Well, regulation is the means by which risk is managed, both at product but also at market level by imposing product requirements. A safe product is defined under the General Product Safety Regulations 2005. And if you go back to the videos on PAS 7050 and 7100, then we do explain that definition of a safe product. As I say, serious risk requires rapid intervention, but where products have their own specific product safety regulations, for example, toys and electrical equipment, those regulations are underpinned by essential requirements, sometimes called essential safety requirements, which are a list of hazards and risks which must be addressed at product design. And therefore, that is again a acknowledgement of risk within product regulation. Now, essential requirements and the general safety requirement under the General Product Safety Regulation lacks detail, lacks testing, lacks quantification. And so standards support this by coming up with methods of test, methods of measuring, and limits for particular hazards. And so harmonized in the EU or designated in GB, standards can be used as an illustration, what's known as a rebuttable presumption of conformity, to demonstrate that your product meets those essential requirements. In very simple terms, corrective actions are required where risk is considered intolerable. So at the design level, you have to design a safe product and you use the regulatory requirements. But if something goes wrong and that risk is intolerable, then corrective actions need to follow. So this definition of a safe product is from the General Product Safety Regulation, and it talks about reasonable foreseeable conditions of use, duration, installation, maintenance, putting into service. Does not present any risk. We know that's impossible. All products present a risk or only the minimum risk compatible with the product's use, considered to be acceptable and consistent with something called the high level of protection. In other words, tolerable. So our legal basis for the consideration of tolerable versus intolerable risk is there in the legislation. And it also provides us with other parameters by which we assess this risk. So characteristics of the products, composition, packaging, instructions, assembly, and where applicable for instructions for installation and maintenance. If it's used with other products, how it's used with other products, what effect that has on other products, but how it's presented, how it's labeled, warnings, instructions for use, and any other indication or information regarding the product. And very, very importantly, the categories of consumer at risk when using the product, in particular, children and the elderly. In other words, the context of use, who the product is aimed at, has an effect on the tolerability of risk. Also worth noting, the feasibility of obtaining higher levels of safety or the availability of other products presenting a lesser degree of risk shall not constitute grounds for considering a product to be a dangerous product. So it's not a direct comparative exercise, it's a contextual tolerability. Now, in saying that, culture changes over time. Products become safer. So if products become safer and that leads to the expectation that all products meet a particular level of safety. That will probably be enshrined in regulation and things move on. But just because somebody comes up with a safer version of something doesn't mean to say all the other versions are unsafe. So I've talked a lot about risk, and we need to consider risk in two different stages. We have pre and post risk assessment. So pre-risk assessment is before the product's made, and whilst the product's being made, it is a risk management process. And then you have post-risk assessment, which always follows an incident. So if there's a problem with a product, then you do post-risk assessment, and that leads to corrective action. So incidents feed into that pre-risk assessment because there's this consistent improvement. If a product is capable of injuring somebody and that's noted, or it does injure somebody, that feeds back into the design process as well as corrective actions. But it also feeds back into the standards making and the legislation itself. So in terms of pre versus post risk assessment, we can define it in these two terms. They're both legal obligations. One is a method and risk level, whereas the other is, that's involved in the management of risk at the design and manufacturing stage. Whereas with post market, i.e. the product's already in circulation, you need to apply a particular methodology, which is PRISM. And also there are European methodologies there as well. Decision 417 of 2019, which is currently being updated, as we understand, but also PRISM here in GB. If you want to know more about these two processes, look at PAS 7050 for pre-market and PAS 7100 for post-market. And here's an illustration of the way in which risk is defined, how it is allocated a value. So this is from regulation 3173, which is an EU delegated regulation on risk and safety gate notifications. On the x-axis, it has probabilities. 1 in 10, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, etc. And on the other axis, it has severity level. 1, 2, 3, 1 being the lowest, 4 being the highest. And basically, a risk level, serious, high, medium, and low, comes out of that. That is the process. We will expand more on that in a moment. There are other ways in which you can actually set this out. And on this slide is the SAGA, previously known as Safety Gate method, portal, where you can actually pre-populate risk assessments and use a template library to actually come up with the hazard type and injury scenarios for particular types of products, and then you fill in the probabilities, and it will give you a risk assessment outcome. So it's useful having a look at that. PRISM doesn't yet have that, but it is made in bright colours. And the bright colours is really good because red is serious and green is low. And you have two different tables. The table for single item risk assessments is the same as the EU methodology. The EU methodology only currently covers single item risk assessments, but also includes an additional table on population level risk. And basically, risk rises if there are more products which have the potential to cause harm. So it's quite logical in that sense. We'll talk more about this later on, but it's just to make everybody aware that it's not just single product risk assessment. You also need to consider the population as well when using PRISM. We can avoid doing a risk assessment quite often. Well, not quite often, but sometimes. Basically because some things are presumed to be serious risk in all circumstances. So any breach of chemical regulation is considered serious risk. Any breach of category 3 personal protective equipment requirements is considered serious risk automatically. And if you have things like angle grinder, chainsaw discs and attachments, in other words, you have an attachment for an angle grinder that turns it into a chainsaw, because that is never going to be safe because it's not got the same safety mechanisms as chainsaws. Now, I've just said it can always be presumed to be serious risk, but it is a rebuttable presumption. In other words, you can refute it by evidence or argument, but your starting point for these is serious risk. If there's reasons why that serious risk doesn't manifest, then you can illustrate that. But in most cases, it's considered to be serious risk. So this applies in England, Scotland, and Wales. If we look at Northern Ireland and the single market EU, there's a much longer list, which has commonality with this. So next slide, please, Geraldine. So if there's probable harm levels corresponding to levels 3 or 4, and consumers are not adequately informed about that risk, that can be considered serious risk. If there's no way of avoiding that, so the conditions and the materialization of the risk need to be inherently linked to the hazard of the product. The economic operator having placed or made the product available on the market, or the provider of an online marketplace having listed it online, indicates the product presents a serious risk. In other words, an economic operator has made the decision it's serious risk. But the product has been subject to recall, withdrawal, or removal from online content based on voluntary measures. The presumption is that it's serious risk. And in common with PRISM, the product contains a chemical substance banned by union harmonisation legislation above the limits established in that legislation. So that is the same as PRISM. So if you have REACH or CLP and a product does not meet those requirements, it is presumed to be serious risk. But then there's this additional list which applies within the single market. Small parts detaching from or present in toys or childcare products for children under 36 months. I mean, we generally presume that to be serious risk anyway, because if you have small parts that come off toys or nursery products, they will be mouthed, they can be ingested or inhaled. But this is now laid down in legislation within the EU. Highly flammable fancy dress costumes intended for children, and nightwear or nightwear fabrics for children. Again, I think we can all agree these things are generally serious risk, and this just avoids having to do this risk assessment. Childcare articles posing a drowning risk. Again, that's that's an extension of the category 3 PPE. But again, drowning risk is very significant, and therefore products which present this drowning risk are automatically presumed to be serious risk. Drawstrings in the head, neck, or upper chest on garments intended for young children. Again, that is something I don't think there's too much debate about. And electrical products with defective components that can lead to electric shock or fire. So just to emphasize, these are presumed to be serious risk. It doesn't say in the regulation that these presumptions are rebuttable, so can be refuted by evidence. But currently, we have to assume that there's always going to be the potential for arguments to be made that products where this presumption is the starting point, that actually the risk cannot manifest itself in the way which it normally would. So next we get on to building an injury scenario. So I pass over to Geraldine now.
Okay, so let's look at the PRISM methodology. So if we look here, we can see the outline of the process flow. We've got the identification of a non-compliant product. We've got the risk triage, the risk assessment, the risk evaluation, the QA, so the quality assurance and reporting and recording, and then we've got the risk management. So if we look at these stages individually, really briefly, we can see here it's outlined in the PRISM document. So if you look at the guidance document, it will show you. So you can look identification of a non-compliant product. Can the product be deemed to present a serious risk? And Mark's just walked us through that. And then we've got the risk triage, which you can see the process here to the right. And this is all available in the guidance document. So we're going to walk through this specifically. Do you want to talk about this one, Mark? The identification of a non-compliant product.
Yeah, so the starting point is usually, and this methodology is designed for market surveillance authorities, but it can be used and should be used by businesses as well, because you need to be working from the same parameters. So if the market surveillance authority identifies that product, they need to know, you know, um, who's using it, how they're using it, what legislation applies, what data sets are available, what they know about this particular product. And that's their starting point. Is this already a notified product? Is it being notified either on the GB product safety database or the EU SAGA, previously called the Safety Gate? Because they can take action already. But it's also useful for businesses to do this in exactly the same way. Because if you um, suspect risk and you find that your product is possibly the same specification or at least looks the same as one that's already been notified, then you've already got your answer, I suspect. And following this, you conduct what's known as a triage. A triage is an initial decision. If every product that could potentially be unsafe was subjected to a full risk assessment using PRISM, then nobody would ever get anything else done. So you need an initial decision, which basically says, is this risk significant or not? There used to be a triage tool that was available where there was a simple algorithm. If it's got the potential to be serious risk, if it's level 3 or level 4 injury, or all of those other things, then yes, you need to do a full risk assessment. Or if it's something which everybody knows about, somebody has done something behaviorally that is completely unexpected, completely untoward, then probably not. You probably don't need to do a risk assessment. Now, that tool isn't available anymore, but the process is still outlined in the PRISM guidance document. And I suggest looking at that for the individual circumstances of where you're trying to make that a decision about, I have a complaint about a product. Do I need to do a full risk assessment, or can I just say, no, we'll determine that data point, we'll record it, and then we'll move on. So, if you do make the decision and it's quite precautionary in its approach, then you need to consider the availability of information and data. Product life cycle, how long does it last? Does it last 3 months or 20 years? Do you need expertise? Do you need to speak to other experts? Do you need to speak to standardization committees? Do you need to speak to risk experts? And determine its priority and urgency. If you get a lot of product safety complaints or a lot of product safety inquiries, then you'll need to carry out a further triage process of what's the urgent thing today versus what's not so urgent. And if you want to identify your trends, if you're getting a lot of data to do with product safety, there are tools that are available to actually harvest your complaint data, but your online reactions, but also online reviews and everything, and draw out the trends within that. And then you carry out the risk assessment if you've made the decision that you need to do it. And there's 2 factors that lie at the heart of this: the severity of the harm, remember, 1 to 4, and the probability that it will occur. How likely is this hazard going to lead to this harm? Now, that sounds simple. It can get complicated because you've got to consider all of the stages, all of the things that actually happen between that hazard manifesting itself or being present all the time and a harm that arises. And we will explain this in greater detail in a moment. And once you've done that, you will get a value: serious, high, medium, or low. And then you need to consider, is it tolerable? So the evaluation is a stage that has always taken place. Can we live with it or not? But is now a detailed part of the process under PRISM, and you're provided with parameters to assist in making that evaluation. So relevant factors such as whether the risk is generating a high level of public or political concern, for example, should be taken into account. But it also documents this decision-making process. So you develop a narrative and you subject that narrative to peer review. So peer review is, what do you think? I think this is intolerable, or I think this is tolerable. Do you think that? Risk assessment is a collective process. Both myself and Geraldine are expert witnesses in risk assessment. We produce reports for the courts, but we never work alone, because I may have a strange idea that when subject to scrutiny, Geraldine says, No, you know that's not the way I would see it, and I suspect that's not the way others would see it. Peer review and evaluation can be very, very informal. It can include polls about, with friends, colleagues, would you use this product in this way or not? Or, have you ever known anybody use this product in this way? So quality assurance is a fundamental part of the process, and you should document this part of the process, the review and how it's subjected to scrutiny and how it changes. It will be modified quite often by that. You may think, well, actually, people always use a product in that particular way and allocate a very high value to it. And somebody else may say, no, I don't think they do. And you may meet in the middle. And so when a risk is intolerable and it's peer reviewed and is still intolerable, then management of that risk needs to follow. So you confirm the action is required, identify the nature of the action needed, and then implement it. And it often involves risk communication as part of this process.
Okay, so let's talk about, we briefly introduced, right, Mark, we spoke about these stages, but let's go into this in detail like you alluded to earlier on. So we're going to look at undertaking the risk assessment. So defining the product, identifying the hazards, who or what could be harmed, the scenarios, determine the severity of harm, the probability of the harm occurring, the level of risk, and then finally the level of uncertainty. So let's take a look at this in a little bit of detail. So defining the product, and all of this information, by the way, that we're sharing with you is available in the PRISM guidance document, and there's some more information available on the Business Companion. So when we're looking at defining the product, the identification is key. Determining the traceability is really important, and any relevant technical documentation. What applicable legislation is there for this particular product, and who and how will the product be used? So things such as the name, the brand, the model, the batch reference, production lot number, the name of the person or business who placed it on the market, the country of origin, and any certification reference. Pictures are also really useful when you're looking at doing a risk assessment. If you can, I always ask for a sample if possible, but you don't have to have an actual product. You can actually do it on the pictures as well. And of course, if it's sold with any other items too. So what are the hazards associated with it? So hazards, as Mark defined earlier, they're the characteristics of the product, and they only become a risk where there's an exposure or a pathway to harm. So in my office at the moment, I've got loads of small parts. They are potentially hazardous, but they're not a risk because I'm not in a daycare centre or a nursery here right now, right? There's not lots of children around that are going to be mouthing on them. So it's important to understand the difference between those things. So we're looking at the hazards. So what are the hazards associated with the product? Normally, when you're doing a PRISM risk assessment or a post-market risk assessment, you're focusing on a few hazards or one. You're not looking at the holistic approach that was mentioned before by Mark. So if there's no hazard, then there's no risk in theory. So you could use testing. If you have a test certificate, that could be great if it's identifying a hazard. They are usually measurable, and the same type of hazard may be different depending on the risk, but looking at the hazard, the type, and any magnitudes that might affect the risk. Multiple hazards should also be looked at. So you might have a product that has a flammability hazard, a burn hazard, as well as laceration, perhaps. But usually we're looking at one or a few. Some hazards are subject to specific legislation, and it depends. And then some hazards also have a reasonable presumption of serious risk, which is mentioned already. We've already explained about that. So sometimes you might know by the hazard straight away, well, we're looking at automatically an assumption of serious risk, but of course you can refute that and still proceed with the risk assessment if you wanted to. So the hazard identification, they've got a list here in the PRISM guidance document. So you can see mechanical, size and shape, and it's just a list of some common product safety hazards. And if you've got some testing, that can be really helpful. So you want to look at who or what can be harmed. So this is usually concerned with physical injury or ill health. We do look a little bit here at psychological health as well. Mental health is covered in some legislation too, but usually we're focusing on physical injury or health. It may involve multiple people, the environment, animals, and property too. So you want to consider who is the product aimed at. Is it a specialist product versus general population? And who else might be at risk? So unintended users or non-users of the product. So it might be an adult product that is actually appealing to children, or it could be something that's used in one room, and because of the vapors or something that happens, it could actually affect the whole building, or like flammability, it could affect more than one place. So people at increased risk, perhaps due to cultural, behavioural or circumstantial factors, language, cognitive or physical disability and age as well, is something that you can consider too. And then we're looking at the specific scenario. So for example, if I had the small part in my room, I was already alluding to a scenario. So the small part is available, it's present, somebody mouths it, ingests it, then chokes on it. That's what we're looking at. That's the harm scenario. So the existence of the hazard, which can foreseeably cause harm during the lifetime of the product, how the user becomes exposed to the risk. So just because there's small parts everywhere doesn't mean it's going to be a choking hazard. It has to enter the oral cavity, and how exposure to the risk results in harm. So, and this is where it gets complex, because we're talking about behaviors, human behaviors and circumstances around the exposure of the product. And we do want to look at the shortest critical path. We don't want to make it really, really long, where there's 10 different steps in order for it to happen, because it's not usually that long for those things. So they're saying here between 3 and 5 steps is usually sufficient. So then we've got one or more harm scenarios. One or more of these steps may need to be broken down further to explain the scenario clearly. As mentioned, it should be kept to a minimum. The nature of probability is such that the more steps there are, generally the lower probability. So if there's 10 or 20 steps for something to happen, it's less likely to happen. So as mentioned here, usually we're looking at 3 to 5 steps. Then we're looking at the severity of the harm. So with choking hazard that I had, if there's a choking hazard in my room, if it's a small spherical item, for example, like a grape type thing, or the size and shape of a grape, I would say that definitely could lead to a level 4, which is a death. So that's what we're looking at, the severity. We had the 4 levels. So we're usually looking at the highest level. There might be that it leads to a level 4 and a level 2. There could be different scenarios. So you might want to do multiple scenarios. So consider the type of hazard, the immediate or delayed harm, the part of the body part, how the hazard causes harm, who is harmed, and how many people are potentially affected. So there's a table within PRISM that shows that. So here you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, or 4. I mentioned that my choking hazard, if it was a small spherical item, I think could certainly lead to fatality. So we were looking at a 4. But you might have something, for example, that would be less than that. And there's more information I'll show you in a moment, where it could just be injury or ill health for basic first aid. So a cut, a paper cut perhaps. A level 2, which is where you may have to go to A&E, but hopefully within 6 months you're recovered. And then a level 3 is where that you may actually be hospitalized, and it could affect you for more than 6 months. It's also important to note here that is there a potential for multiple casualties? And that's what's asked for here in the PRISM document, yes or no here on the right. Just to show you, they have another chart here on the left of the screen. If you go to the PRISM guidance documents, you'll see that gives you some more information: minor cuts, bruising, pinching, degree, burn degree, etc. They'll let you know at what level, just as an example or a guidance. And then here we've got a screenshot here from decision from 2019, so 2019-417, which was available in the EU. And I like the way that it's laid out. When you're doing risk assessment, you can use any information that's available to you to help you develop that risk assessment and data that's available. And I like the way the chart's laid out here, because it shows you the different type of injuries, and it continues within the document. And then it's got 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's from decision 2019-417. So then we need to look at the probability of the harm occurring. So this is usually the most challenging part of the assessment. So you have to assign the numbers to each of those steps. So if I said, small part present in my room, someone mouthing, then they choke on it and die. Those probabilities associated with that can be really, really difficult. But if you have data, it can be really helpful. And we're going to show you an example of that in a moment. So we need to determine the probability of each individual step. It's a behavioural step, which makes it really difficult, but the use of data and estimation tools can be really, really helpful. So we'll show you some examples in a moment. If there's no data, then you can make an estimation. You can just say, in my opinion, this is what I think it is. And there's a really useful chart. Also, any injury data that's available can be very helpful too. And on the OPSS PRISM website, there's a really useful list of resources that you can use for collecting data. So this is the chart that's really useful. If I can't assign if I don't have time, perhaps, or I don't have any data to back up what I'm doing, or perhaps, part exposed, the choking part exposed from a product, I've sent it for testing and it takes 7 to 10 days. While I'm waiting for that, I can do a guesstimate here based on that. I could say, well, actually, I think it might be 1 in 10 or 1 in 100. Or if I have 10 samples, I could drop them or throw them or see what happens and see, and then just say that. That's the important thing, is to say, well, I threw 10, one of them exposed a small part. So that's what it's based on. It's based on me doing that. And until you get any further information, that is your judgment based on that. And you can do this in a room. If you've got a room of 10 people, or you're doing a session, 20 people, you can ask them, how many people think that with this small part that's going to be mouthed by a child, or you may have some data that can support you. So it's just really important to explain how you've come up with that number, even if it is an estimation. So just explain that. This document's table 5 from the PRISM guidance document that's available on the OPSS website. So some other consideration, you should also consider who the product's aimed at, where the particular risk is identifiable, how the product will be used, the frequency of use, the condition required for the harm to occur, any test reports or technical documentation or product homogeneity. That's really important too. So if you have information in the technical file or technical documentation that can support you with the risk assessment, then I would highly recommend that you use that. And then once we've done all of those, I know it sounds like we're really simplifying it, and we are, then you determine the level of risk. So basically you multiply those probabilities. So you multiply each of those steps as explained here, and then you'll come out with a rating: serious, high, medium, or low. We're going to walk through an example with you in a minute. And the risk rating will be for the individual products. So then we need to look at the population. So are you selling 10 of these? Are you selling 10 million? Then there's something you need to just consider when you're doing the risk assessment. So let's talk about that really briefly here. So we've got the single item versus the all risk item, all of the items. Mark, do you want to explain that really quickly?
Yeah, so when you are looking at a injury scenario and particular behavioral components and all of those other things, then you will come up with a probability of 1 in whatever by combining those probabilities together. That is only part of the story. So part of the story is the risk that that individual product presents, but it depends in terms of the tolerability on how many of that different types of product, how many of those products are presenting that particular individuated risk to other people. So what PRISM includes is an additional table where you cross-reference the your initial risk rating for single items with the population of products that are currently in circulation. So if you've got more than 1 million products in circulation, a medium risk becomes a serious risk, because if something is tabulated individually as a medium risk, then people are going to get injured. And actually, if if you have a large population of products, then people are definitely going to get injured. And therefore, you need to take account of that in terms of the tolerability. And so this then, although it doesn't tell you about tolerability anymore, it means that more things are serious risk, because serious is always serious, but high can become serious where you have more than 500,000 products. A medium can become serious where you have more than 1 million products, because it's about managing that risk. But there's always uncertainty in this. So you always need to consider that level of uncertainty. So, it attempts to tabulate, predict the likelihood of future harm in what is, when you include human beings, but also the production process for products, a chaotic system, incomplete data. So there's always a level of uncertainty. And so, there's all kinds of uncertainties that can creep in. Identification of accuracy of the harm scenario, estimating probability of harm, and using the most commonly verifiable probabilities for all steps. So there are various parameters you apply, and doesn't make any difference to your risk assessment other than you need to state your level of uncertainty. So in stating your level of uncertainty, you are being transparent. You're saying, right, a low level of uncertainty gives me high confidence in this risk assessment, but a high level of uncertainty gives me low confidence. So where you have a low level of uncertainty, it typically exists where the risk being assessed well understood, been the subject of previous similar risk assessment by market surveillance authorities. There may be scientific research data available. Spherical small parts on toys designed for children under 3 is a very, very clearly understood risk. And therefore, a risk assessment on that would be a low level of uncertainty. Medium is where you've got a mixture, where you've got some relevant data, but some of it's, is unvalidated, or it's old, or it's estimated. And a high level of uncertainty would typically exist where there's little relevant evidence and the risk is not well understood. Often be the case with novel products, or where you have new behaviors that stimulated by social media and things like that, or a combination of the two, or a hazard that previously hasn't existed with a particular type of product, and therefore you're forced to estimate either the way people behave with that product, the way they use it, or the characteristics of the product itself. So, and then you carry out a sensitivity analysis. So uncertainty and sensitivity analysis are linked, because the more uncertainty you have, the wider the parameters for your sensitivity analysis. So in other words, what the sensitivity analysis is varying some of the parameters of your risk assessment, either probabilities or other elements, within the range of uncertainty, to determine, does that change the risk outcome? Does it change its tolerability? And if it doesn't, then you can still have a degree of certainty in your action arising from it. For market surveillance authorities, they always try to reduce this uncertainty by investigation. But sometimes that's impossible, particularly with the way that human beings behave. You can't wait for people to injure themselves to have a data set that says people will injure themselves in a particular set of circumstances. And you can't do that if you're a business either. So following that, you evaluate it. Evaluation is the most fun stage as far as I'm concerned, because it is subjective. You contextualize this raw risk rating, give it meaning in the context of regulatory activity, but also commercial activity. And it's always been undertaken, but now it's in the methodology. The risk level on its own sometimes isn't very informative. Medium risk. Medium risk, what does it mean? It's neither high nor low. It's definitely not serious. What do I do about this? And therefore, you need a set of tools to discuss that, to challenge it, to determine whether or not it's tolerable. And in doing that, it also assists you in determining, if it's not tolerable, what actions arise from it. And as I've previously said, sometimes risk is not tolerable, even if it is not serious. And even if it's low in some cases. I come across risks that have been low within the system, but are definitely not tolerable. So the risk evaluation is a narrative stage where you consider a set of parameters which are laid down in PRISM. Who's at risk, the potential for psychological harm, something called the prevalence forecast. How many of these products are going to be in circulation? How long are they going to last? How many more are going to be in circulation? How uncertain you are. What the comparative level of risk is with other products that fulfill a similar function. Whether or not multiple casualties could arise out of it. Is it, this differential between compliant risk and non-compliant risk? Vulnerabilities, people at increased risk, but also action taking place elsewhere. Now, this is a guide for market surveillance authorities. So, if this product is subject to action in another jurisdiction, should we be considering that action? But it's also relevant for economic operators, because if somebody else is taking risk management action on a product that's the same as yours, then it may indicate that your risk, whilst you may consider it tolerable, may be considered intolerable by other people. And other factors, public political concern, tolerability of the public, societal tolerance, benefits of product outweigh the risk. We accept products that present significant risk all the time because the benefits outweigh them. Ladders, chainsaws. trampolines because trampolines keep our children amused. So we accept that risk. It's tolerable. Um, has there been adequate consideration of something called design risk management? In other words, could the product have been safer? And so, with any identifiable hazard, the potential to cause harm, can it be eliminated? If it can't be eliminated, could the risk be mitigated, guarded against? And only if those previous two stages have been exhausted, then warnings be applied. I will talk about this a little bit later on in greater detail. Is the product compliant with basic regulatory requirements? What's the overall risk presented by the product? Multiple hazards, increased risk. If you can injure people in a multitude of different ways, then again, there is a higher probability that people will get injured. What's the nature of the risk? This is something called the shape of the risk. High severity, but low probability versus low severity, high probability. We tend to find low severity, high probability injuries, i.e., lots of people suffer very minor injuries, to be more tolerable than high severity, low probability. One person in a large population suffers serious injury or even death. So we find one more acceptable than the other, and we do this all the time. It is a societal approach to this. Risks to non-users, risks to vulnerable users impact on it. Risk presented by defective protective products are obviously significant, because if you're relying on something for protection, it's not offering that protection, you're going to behave in a particular way. The ability or inability of the user to control risk. Can the user have ownership of the risk? Can they see the hazard and take their own action, or does it creep up on them? And deliberate non-compliances. So products that deliberately don't comply with regulation are less likely to be tolerable than products that do comply. And again, and I want to emphasize this at the risk of overemphasizing it. Intolerable risks, risk management action is necessary. For intolerable risks, it's not usually, but there still may need to be action to address any relevant non-compliance for the product. So over to Geraldine for a worked example.
Thanks, Mark. So let's quickly take a look at an example that is on the OPSS PRISM website. There's actually 6 available. So we've just picked one to just break down in practical terms what we've just been speaking about. So how do you actually do the risk assessment? So here we've got a summer garment, a short sort of top with decorative cords, as you can see. It's for children under 3. The cord is 342 millimeters in length, which is prohibited within the relevant standard EN 14682. And this would be covered under the GPSR 2005. So when we look at the PRISM methodology, we've got identification of a non-compliant product. So can the product be deemed to present a serious risk? In this case here, they're saying no, and they're going ahead with the risk assessment. But if you wanted to, you could automatically assume that yourself. And remember, this guidance document is written for market surveillance officers. So the list that we have from PRISM in GB, it's not listed in there. Remember, it was category 3 PPE, it was chemical, and it was the chains or disc attachments that we looked at. So it's not in that list. And it is up to you whether you want to proceed with doing a risk assessment or not. So if a full risk assessment is required, so yes or no, and then you can do a risk triage. And again, you could amend these processes to make them relevant for you and your organization. Maybe there is going to be a time where you automatically assume serious risk. So then we've got this risk triage. And looking here, maybe you already know you want to go straight into corrective action. And I think sometimes, regardless of the risk level, when I'm working with clients, I say you should be working on the corrective action while we're busy doing this risk assessment, because sometimes it takes time, especially if they're asking us to do it, Mark and I to do it. It can take a number of days to do it. So you should be looking at corrective action, because there's obviously something that is a bit of a challenge when you're doing a risk assessment. So you need to prepare for the risk assessment, which we're going to show you how they've done that on the OPSS website, and then going through the actual risk assessment itself. Preparing is basically finding data. So going away, becoming a researcher, having a look at your own in-house information is going to be so valuable. Have you got complaint data? Have you got information that can help you? And here they've given the example, which I think is incredibly valuable. If you look at all the examples on the OPSS PRISM website, they're all for different products. And maybe the data they've looked at is really useful for you. So you could download that and keep that in your own data library internally. So looking here specifically at strangulation, and they're talking about the ergonomics and the biology of children, and they've got the footnote with the information, and then they've got the size of windpipes, etc. It's getting very, very specific, and then they've got further information to really good resources for data that you can use if you ever come across doing this risk assessment yourself. They've also looked at injury data, which is my favorite thing. One of my favorite websites is the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission NICE data. It's known as the National Electronic Injury Surveillance. Again, they have that link on the OPSS website, and they looked at the data and they found there were 27 deaths and 70 non-fatal incidents. And they also looked at China, which is great, looking at different countries to try and get data. And they've reported 192 clothing-related incidents. So these are really good data resources that they have, and they've documented. That's the key thing, is about documenting. It doesn't necessarily matter whether it's anecdotal, whether it's a discussion forum, whatever it is. If you've used it in your decision, or you had it as a reference when you were making some decisions, then document them. This is obviously a worked example, so they haven't got a manufacturer model, batch numbers, etc. But the more information you can get on this, the better, more confident you can be. And sometimes this takes time. So again, you can start the assessment and come back and amend it after. So the product's been defined, so we've completed that. We're looking at a specific hazard. So I mentioned earlier, normally you're only looking at 1 or 2. So we're looking at entanglement, strangulation. We're looking at very young, under 3. And then they've developed a scenario. And it's okay if in your organisation somebody says, well, I don't agree with step 1, I think it should be like this. Then that's basically the sensitivity analysis. So you could do multiple scenarios. And when you look at the Excel spreadsheet, the toolkit on the OPSS website for PRISM, you can do that. There's space for doing multiple scenarios. But what they've done here, they've come out with 4 steps. So a young child is wearing the top with the cords in a low supervision context, such as a playpen, high chair, bouncer, car seat, and pushchair. The decorative cord attached to the top becomes entangled around the child's neck. The child cannot free themselves from the source of entrapment, and it's not noticed by a parent or caregiver. And then the level 4 injury occurs. Okay, so let's look at the breakdown of the probabilities. Let's look at step 1 and what probability has been assigned. So this first step is a young child wearing the top with a decorative cord in a low supervision context, such as a playpen, high chair, bouncer, car seat, or pushchair. And they've explained here the summer garment is designed for children under 3 due to the size and age recommendation. And children of this age are encouraged to have regular periods of sleep. So based on best judgment, that's all they're saying. It's a judgment, best judgment. They're given a probability of 0.02 to the likelihood of this actual step happening. Now, in the OPSS PRISM document, it has the decimal of 0.02. Now, for me, it helps with my understanding if I put it in a fraction, 1 in 50 or 2%. And I'm going to be totally honest, because I often get this wrong, and Mark corrects me on it. And it's a great way when you're going through your quality assurance just to make sure, is this right? Are we making sense of these numbers? And I just think it's really useful to have a fraction and percentage, because I think if you're ever presenting this, Mark and I both work as expert witness. If you're ever in a court situation, you're ever been questioned or cross-examined, and this could be internally, right? Then you want to make sure that you understand and that it sounds right to you. And that actually is part of the quality assurance process, I believe. It's certainly part of our processes. So checking the probability, checking the numbers, and does it make sense? Does it fit right? And does it sit? So hopefully this makes sense for step 1. We've just explained it. I'm not going to read all the steps for you, because you can see those on the slide, and you can also see them on the OPSS PRISM website. So again, they're saying here that they think the probability based on the way that children are behaving, the evidence that the cords and drawstrings within clothing pose a severe risk of injury or death. It's happened before. There probably is some data out there, and they think it is 0.01, so 1 in 100 or 1%. And then step 3, where the child cannot free themselves. And again, they've given some more information, the cord, their heads weigh proportionately more than their bodies, etc. So they're just giving a little bit more information about why that made that decision. And then when it comes to the quality assurance, it makes it a lot easier to have a discussion when you've explained why you've done what you've done. If somebody says, oh, well, I don't agree with that, I think it should be this or that, that's where the sensitivity analysis comes in. So again, based on best judgment, a conservative probability of 0.1, and as we've put in here for this slide, 1 in 10 or 10%. Again, 4, so this is asphyxia, is the second most cause of accidental child death in the UK after road traffic accidents. And basically they're saying because of that, we're saying this is a 0.1 or a 1 in 10 or a 10% chance of that happening. What you then do is you multiply the probabilities. So 0.02 times 0.01 times 0.1 times 0.1 gives you 0.000002. And again, I would put that in a percentage or a fraction, because that number for me doesn't really make much sense in my brain. It might to some people, but it's really nice to put it in a bit of perspective, which is what they do on the example here. So now we have all this information. We have the numbers, we have the compound probability, we have the probabilities, we have the steps. Let's look at the risk. So as mentioned, they calculate these, they multiply them, and then it comes out in a 1.5 million. And I think it's a really useful to have that context. And if you know how many you've sold, etc., it can help just put it in a bit of perspective. And they're saying for a level 4 injury, that's then considered a medium risk. And they're referring to this table here, which is medium. But you might want to look exactly as we mentioned about the sales, how many you're selling. If you're selling, 100 million of these, then it's just a step in there to make you think, hang on a second, that could be quite a lot we're talking about here, versus if I've sold 10 of them. So it's really a decision making thing at that point. Right, let's think about this in perspective of all of the items. And then we've got the level of uncertainty. They're saying here there's a medium level of uncertainty. The injury scenario takes into consideration consumer behavior. They have some data, but they don't have data for every single step. So they're basically saying we've got a medium level of uncertainty. And then they do that sensitivity analysis. So for step 4, they were saying it's an area of uncertainty. So they looked at amended that and changing that and seeing actually, did it make a difference to the overall outcome? And I find that this quite often comes up when you're having discussion with your colleagues. They'll say, well, I don't agree with step 3. Let's change it to whatever number and do that. Get the Excel spreadsheet from PRISM and just change it. And it might not actually make a difference in the end anyway. But what's important is to note that you've done that. We had a discussion, this is what we did, and it didn't make a difference anyway. Or we had a discussion, it made a difference, but we decided to go with whatever one. Just explain that. And the risk evaluation here is talking about that tolerability that we've spoken about. And I think this relates to the risk appetite of the business. So the risk appetite of one business is going to be very different to another. And I think that's really important to understand. And if I'm honest, some clients I work with, because they haven't defined what that is, it makes it very difficult. And I think sometimes they're expecting me or Mark to define what that is. We will tell you what it is you need to do. It's then up to you to make the decision within the information that you have. You'll know everything about where the product is, how can you isolate it, what systems you have in place. And that's why the PASs are so important. 70/50 and 7/100. Can you actually, take it offline very quickly if you're selling it online, or does it have to go through 100 steps? How much can you do within the time frame that you have? So risk evaluation is really, really important, thinking about tolerability. And they've just given an explanation on that. And it's really important, as they've done, to just explain your thoughts on this. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. I think you agree with me, Mark, right? Because they're putting the inner workings of their head out on a piece of paper. And sometimes people feel a bit vulnerable doing that. But it's so important to do that so you can justify what you did when you did it. Okay, so let's briefly talk about risk management before we come to the end of the session, Mark.
Yeah, so when we carry out a risk assessment, then sometimes it's not tolerable, it's intolerable. And we've already said, if it's intolerable, we need to manage risk. The European legislative framework, General Product Safety Regulation, General Product Safety Directive, which is the UK assimilated regulation, harmonized regulations, that's CE or UKCA marking, all require legally that if risk is intolerable, then you manage it. So the appropriate type of corrective action to manage risk might not always be the most obvious one, given the level of risk. So it's not always directly proportionate. So there is no algorithm that can apply. Serious risk equals recall. High risk equals withdrawal. It will depend on what is necessary to reduce the risk to a tolerable level. So sometimes serious risk might be warning. Sometimes low risk might be recall. It will depend on how you translate that risk from intolerable to tolerable. So there are many different approaches to the management of risk, and some are addressed specifically in the regulation. So say there's recall, withdrawal, marking, warning, but also modification in people's homes and all of those other things. And as we go into the future, there'll even be potentially be the possibility of modifying things in people's in people's pockets. It'd be their phone or something else. And, I believe that's already been done with one product to at least, disable it. And that brings me on to the particular levels of risk management that you have. If you want more information on risk assessment and risk management, have a look at a document called ISO 31000, International Standards Organization, document 31000, that sets out the principles of risk management. This is design, but also post-market. If you can eliminate the source of the harm, the risk, then do so. But if you can't, mitigate it. But if you can't do either of those, then warn people. But sometimes warning people early on allows them to mitigate it, the ones who listen, and allows you to eliminate it later on. So the example I just gave of a product being modified whilst people possessed it via the internet, that's an elimination tactic. This product was switched off. It was disabled. That eliminates the hazard because the hazard arose from use in the battery. Other ways in which this is framed is also in occupational health and safety, and any process or environment involving risk. So in occupational health and safety, it's called the hierarchy of control. Eliminate, control, and warn. And again, this is another way of framing exactly the same things. And we do it humanly. We think, can I eliminate that potential source of harm? Yes, I can. Well, I will then. But sometimes, I need to be careful. Careful is a mitigation. Or I need to tell other people, be careful. That's a warning. So, as I've already said, it is risk is the key feature of the regulatory environment in which products are manufactured, distributed, supplied, and used. It's always about risk management, either at design but also post hoc. Corrective action, although not necessarily proportionate to the risk rating, has got to be proportionate to the overall potential for harm and what is necessary to reduce risk. And as I've already said, regulatory tools are there for market surveillance authorities, but also should be considered proactively by businesses if you find intolerable risk.
So just to mention really briefly, and Mark, you've already alluded towards
Yeah.
one, right? The Samsung recall that happened. And if you search on the internet, you'll find a lot of information about both of these cases. The picture on the right is to do with the Mattel recall that happened in 2007. And again, there's a lot of information. And this is basically risk assessment and risk management in practice, what happens in real life situations. I'd never did the risk assessment on any of these. However, I think, with the Mattel one, it was led. So obviously now with the new guidance we have, that's automatically assumption serious risk, but also the magnets as well. And then with Samsung, I don't know if it was serious risk or high risk or medium, but regardless, corrective action had to be taken, and it was taken very, very quickly with some of these. Sometimes they took longer than others with other ones, but it's really interesting to see the complexities of it. This is really a difficult thing sometimes, of course it is, but there's a lot of learnings when we look at other businesses and how they've done things. So just if you want to do some further research or looking at risk management in action, then we recommend looking at these cases, and there's lots out there. We know there's links here on the slide which you won't necessarily be able to access, but in some of the guidance document that we have on the Business Companion and also on the OPSS PRISM website, a lot of these links are available. Things like the lexicon, scientific groups, the accident statistics, etc. Have a look at those. We highly recommend some further reading if you want to read more into this. But we're now at the end of the session. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening to this session, and we hope that you've learned a lot about risk assessment.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.